So, hello and welcome to this talk on the seven-eyed model of supervision. This is the book in which you can find this seven-eyed model. It's called Supervision in the Helping Professions. I've got the fourth edition here. I believe there's a fifth, for what it's worth. Written by Peter Hawkins and Robert Shohet. And it's Peter Hawkins who developed this seven-eyed model that we're looking at today. And here he is. This is Peter Hawkins. And in this book, you can find this seven-eyed model of supervision in chapter 7. I like to think they did that on purpose. And I'll start with just the name. So if you think of the word supervision, you've got the word vision here, which is something to do with looking or vision, and super, which means above. So in some sense, supervision is a space where you can get a bird's eye view, or you can look from above at the work you're doing with your clients to get a different perspective on that work. So from that sense, this talk and looking at this seven-eyed model of supervision is helpful. Yes, obviously for supervisors, if you're a training supervisor, but also if you're a counsellor or therapist wanting to make the best use of your supervision. So these eyes then, these seven eyes, not eyes as in eye, but eyes as in eye, are the seven perspectives or seven different visions we can take. So this chapter from this book is based on the original research done by Peter Hawkins for those supervising counsellors or psychotherapists. This model has later been developed by the Centre for Supervision and Team Development and Bath Consultancy Group to encompass all practitioners in the helping professions. Hence the title of the book, Supervision in the Helping Professions, and not just supervision in counselling and psychotherapy. But from my perspective, I'm a therapist, so that's where I come from. So this model is relational and systemic. What does that mean? Well, it's relational in the sense that it looks at the relationships between both you, the therapist, and your clients, and you, the therapist, and your supervisor. And it's systemic in that it also looks at the wider systems which influence these two relationships. So, for example, your governing body, which for me is the BACP, the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, could also be, say, the client's family. That could be a system that influences the client work. Maybe the organization that referred you your client, like an agency or the NHS, that could be a system that influences your work. This is, I suppose, in contrast to other models of supervision. For example, there are developmental models of supervision, which look at the therapist's journey from, say, a novice to an expert. And the focus of supervision is helping them progress in their skill and career. This is not that. More of that is referenced in this book, but this seven-eyed model is relational and systemic rather than, say, developmental. So Peter Hawkins was researching different ways in which experienced supervisors supervised, looking at their different styles. And out of that research, he noticed that there were differences in the choices they made depending on where they were paying attention. They could be paying attention to themselves, the supervisor, their thoughts and feelings, to the supervisee, to the client, to the contexts in which they worked, or to the wider systems. So he noted that the supervision process involves two interlocking systems, two relationships. the client and supervisee relationship, the client-therapist relationship, or the supervisee-supervisor relationship. And each of these two major styles of managing the supervision, so either focusing on this relationship between you and your client, or this relationship between you and your supervisor, can be subdivided into three categories depending on where you focus your attention. That gives 6 modes or I's of supervision, plus the 7th mode or I that focuses on the wider context in which the supervision and the client work take place. Thus, you have these two relationships and the wider systems. Thus, it is relational and systemic. So I'm going to attempt to draw these 7 I's and explain them. So what do we have here? We have the client. Let's say you go to supervision and you talk about your client, a client. This is mode 1. Very common thing to do, particularly if you're talking about this client for the first time. You might talk about how they appear, how they look, how they present themselves, what clothes they wear, their mannerisms, the way in which they talk, the way in which they sit. You're painting a picture in your supervisor's mind of this human being. You're bringing the person of this client into the room before you focus on theories, interventions. Which brings us on to mode 2. So how do you intervene to help this person get what they want from therapy? How do you help them to suffer less or to reach their goals? What interventions do you use and why? This is mode 2. Again, particularly if you're in training, a very common mode of supervision is to focus on, what are we doing and why? What's the theories and case formulation and treatment plan, and what interventions am I using? How are they going? Are they having the desired effect or not? If not, why not? And what might we be able to do differently? This, of course, takes place between the relationship between the therapist here and the client. So this is mode 3. Mode 3 is the relationship between the therapist and the client. So if you were a fly on the wall watching these two people interact, what would you notice? What's the dynamic between them? What games are being played, perhaps, or what metaphors or images would you use to describe this relationship? Does it look like a mother-child relationship, for example? Does it look like two people interlocked in some sort of fight? Does it look like some sort of power game? What relationships might the client be transferring onto the therapist and vice versa? This is all a part of mode 3. Mode 4 would be looking more purely just at the therapist's thoughts and feelings. For example, if there was some countertransference that the therapist was bringing in with this client or many of their clients, and it was less a co-created dynamic between the two, but more just the therapist's personal stuff they were bringing into the room, that might be looked at in mode 4. You can also just think of this as the supportive side of supervision, where the therapist comes in to offload, to share how they're feeling, how they're doing, to get some counselling support from their supervisor. That could be considered mode 4 too. Talking of the supervisor, that's represented here. This is the supervisor. The relationship between therapist and supervisor is mode 5. So similarly to mode 3, where we looked at the dynamic between the client and the therapist, mode 5 might look at the dynamic between the therapist and the supervisor. What particularly might stand out here is a parallel process. That is when a dynamic that is happening between these two, therapist and client, ends up being mirrored or repeated in this relationship. So let's say this client is kind of cagey, not giving much away, and the therapist is feeling frustrated. Perhaps the therapist will talk about this client to the supervisor, be a bit cagey, not give much away, and the supervisor will feel frustrated. So this repeated pattern of a relational dynamic can be helpful to highlight to make sense of this relationship, but it's done so by putting one's attention on this relationship between the therapist and the supervisor. And then you have mode 6, which is purely looking at the supervisor's thoughts and feelings. So it's much a crossover between mode 5, but this also includes what in this model they've now called 6A, which is not just the supervisor's thoughts and feelings whilst with the therapist, but the supervisor's fantasy relationship with this client. So, for example, the supervisor might say something like, well, I feel like if I was sitting with this client, I might be tempted to do this, or I might think about this, or I might want to know this. So if the supervisor is sharing with the therapist the supervisor's fantasy relationship with the client, if they were their therapist, that would be 6A. Whereas 6 would just be the supervisor's thoughts and feelings whilst with the therapist. And finally, mode 7 is all the context that encompasses these two relationships. Mode 7. Literally all the systems outside of these relationships which have some bearing on these relationships. For example, if you were referred these clients through the NHS and the way in which it affects your client work will be part of mode 7. Let's say you have a limited number of sessions with this client and that is impacting how you're feeling and your relationship with a client. You might talk about that within the context of the organization that limits those sessions. The ethical framework of, at least with my governing body, the BACP, might influence your client work and how you think about clients. And so that would be part of mode 7. Everything, the global pandemic, the death of the Queen, anything that could affect these two relationships, anything that comes in could be part of mode 7 and where we place our attention, particularly if they're having a significant effect on either of these relationships. So that is the 7 eyes of the 7-eyed model. So let's look back then at this chapter 7. So this supervision process involves these two interlocking systems, the client supervisee and the supervisee supervisor, which can be further subdivided into 3 categories each, plus this 7th mode, which focuses on the context. So we end up with a more neatly drawn picture here of the 7 modes. 1, the client, 2, the interventions, 3, the client-therapist relationship, 4, the therapist, their thoughts and feelings, 5, the relationship between therapist and supervisor, 6, the supervisor's thoughts and feelings, then also 6A, the supervisor's fantasy relationship with the therapist's client, and finally mode 7, which involves all these contexts in which these two relationships take place. So then, to distinguish between these modes in their pure form has some advantages. It allows supervisors to be clear about their own style and its strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, if I raise my attention to this model, I might think to myself, I really do focus a lot on interventions when I'm supervising therapists, and I might be neglecting our relationship. That might help me raise awareness to that. But it can also be used by the supervisee, the therapist themselves, and give them a language to negotiate changes in supervision style and a tool in a regular two-way review and appraisal of supervision. So it hands some power back to the therapist to say, look, I really like this about supervision, but I think maybe our relationship could be more of a focus sometimes. And it helps them negotiate that. It can be useful in training supervisors. So you can just focus on refining how you might use each mode separately so that you can then learn to integrate the 7 modes, put them together. So let's spend the rest of our time just digging into each mode in more detail. So mode 1, focusing on the client and how they present. So often the first task in every supervision exploration is to ask the supervisee to describe their clients accurately. This requires the clear focus of a portrait painter or a Zen archer. And the supervisor's job is to help the supervisee stay with this task, this difficult task. It involves challenging the assumptions that the supervisee makes and asking them to return to what they saw or what the client said rather than their interpretations. So it's trying to observe without evaluating, which is a hard task. It sounds easy. You're just describing your experience of this client, but you're trying to do it without judgments and interpretations and bringing theory into it yet. You're just giving your supervisor a picture of this person in their mind's eye. Often new practitioners are anxious to apply theory, and this can lead them to stop seeing the actuality of the unique human being they are with, and can lead to objectification and seeing the client as a challenge to their therapeutic prowess. So if I'm feeling insecure that I'm not doing a good enough job, that insecurity might lead me to just see this human being as a challenge to my self-esteem, a challenge to my job security. And I'm in that anxiety, I might miss the human being that I'm actually working with, particularly when I'm talking about them in supervision. So in mode 1, we can help gradually become aware of the internal dialogue inside our heads, the judgments, the expectations, the self-doubt, and we can separate that from our actual experience of just being with this client prior to mode 2, prior to looking at theory or interventions, just bringing the human being of this client into the room. There, of course, is a place for theorizing and using theory to understand the client, but this must always come after a direct encounter with the client in the fullness of their unique being, which segues nicely into mode 2, exploring the strategies and interventions used by the supervisee. Now, I find that less is said about mode 2 in this model, and I think that's because it completely depends on what modality you work with. And this supervisor model, this 7-eyed model, is not modality specific. So if you're a CBT therapist and supervisor, if you're a person-centered or psychodynamic, you can apply this model to supervision, but mode 2 will be radically different depending on what modality you work with. Nonetheless, in this mode, the supervisor focuses on what interventions the supervisee makes in their work with clients, how and why they made these interventions, and which interventions they would rather have made. You can evaluate the effectiveness of your interventions, and if you're stuck, you can use supervision to generate new options by brainstorming. Here they recommend just saying whatever comes to your mind, get out the ideas, don't evaluate or judge them straight away. use the other person's ideas as a springboard to generate more, and just keep creating. It says here, include the wildest options you can invent just to help be creative, and before honing in on what might be most helpful for this client. In terms of the supervisor, it says here, we find the maxim, never know better and never know first, useful. So if you're a supervisor and you have ideas that you're eager to tell your therapist about, you might just hold back on that, allow the therapist to use their own creativity and critical thinking to generate ideas, to make sense of this client using a case formulation or a treatment plan. And maybe when they've really exhausted that, you might then add a few options to the table if you think it's applicable. You might also look at which options are compulsively used and which are most avoided using. And then you can discover things about yourself, your strengths and weaknesses. You know, if I'm always avoiding a particular type of intervention, like, challenge or something that involves more assertiveness, and I much more lean towards empathy, reflection, then you can look at this, across your clients and look at your own strengths and weaknesses, decide what you might need more practice on. The supervisee prepares for how they will take what they have learned in the supervision forward to their next encounter with the client. So rather than just brainstorming and leaving it there, hopefully you come to some sort of resolution or conclusion about the path forward. That's also involved in mode 2. Mode 3 is focusing on the relationship between the client and the supervisee. So it's neither on the client nor the supervisee nor the interventions, as in mode 2, but on the systems between them. This focuses on the conscious and unconscious interaction between the therapist and client. So how did you meet? How and why did this client choose you as a therapist? What did you first notice about your the nature of your first contact with this client? The supervisor here is trying to help the therapist stand outside the relationship in which they might be enmeshed or submerged and look at it and see its pattern, like a fly on the wall. You might find an image or metaphor to represent the relationship. You might imagine what kind of relationship you'd have if you met in other circumstances. If you met this client at a party or on the train, how do you imagine that relationship would look? Under what circumstances could you meet this person if it was outside of therapy? Are they kind of like your peer group? Are they more like your mom or dad or your children, nephews, nieces? Would you be most likely to meet them, in a library or in a club or in a cafe or at the gym? All these can kind of help you think about the dynamic that might be happening between you. Help the supervisee see the relationship as a whole rather than just from their own perspective. So again, it's that stepping outside and looking in. So part of this involves looking at the client's transference. How might the client be viewing the therapist that are being transferred from an earlier relationship? So are they kind of viewing the therapist like a teacher or a parental figure, or some sort of oppressive authority, or some sort of loving motherly figure? These images and metaphors give important clues to the transference. If, for example, the supervisee said the relationship was like two sparring partners in a boxing ring, that's very different from if they said the relationship was like a frightened rabbit wanting to cuddle up to its mother. So let's move on to mode 4, which obviously has a big crossover with mode 3, but this is just looking at the supervisee. So the focus on the supervision is on the internal processes of the supervisee. This includes the emotional reactions and resonances of the supervisee, often called countertransference. Here they talk about 5 different types of countertransference. Transference feelings of the supervisor stirred up by this particular client. So it's not how I might usually feel with people, but this particular person has me feel this way. Number 2, the feelings and thoughts that arise out of playing the role transferred onto him by the client. So if the client responds to you as if you were her mother, you might find yourself feeling protective and angry, just like this client's mother did. The supervisor's feelings, thoughts, and actions used to counter this transference. So if the client treats you as a mother figure and you find yourself becoming very masculine and businesslike to avoid feeling this way, it's a slightly different reaction to this first one where you fall into it. You might find yourself resisting it and countering that with the opposite reaction. Projected material of the client that the supervisee has taken in somatically, psychically, or physically. So this is purely the client's feelings, thoughts or feelings that you're now having. They've managed to sort of project them into you. And finally, aim attachment countertransference. This is where we want the client to change for our sake and not theirs, because we want to see ourselves as successful. And we feel that the work with this client is a reflection of our own well-being as a professional. So if I have feelings of desperation for you to progress and get better for my own sake, for my own self-esteem, that's this aim attachment countertransference. So we might explore all of these in mode 4. And when we raise awareness to any of these, it gives us the space to respond from being aware that this is happening rather than reacting to. So if I'm feeling particularly loving or protective towards this client out of this countertransference, rather than just acting on that, I can notice it's happening and then decide what to do with that. So mode 5 then, focusing on the supervisory relationship. These final 2 modes, the supervisor practices what he or she preaches and attends to how the work with the clients can enter and change the supervisory relationship. So I like this idea of practicing what you preach. Okay, if you're helping your client raise awareness to dynamics between them and helping the therapist raise awareness between them and their clients and having them look to themselves for insight, you can also model that by looking at your own dynamic and your own thoughts and feelings as the supervisor. In the mode of paralleling, the processes at work currently in the relationship between client and supervisee are uncovered through how they are reflected in the relationship between supervisee and supervisor. For example, if I have a client who is very withholding, who had a mother or father who was very withholding, for example, when I present them to my supervisor, I may well do this in a very withholding way. So the client withholds to me, the therapist, and then I end up withholding to my supervisor. So it parallels. In effect, I become my client and attempt to turn my supervisor into me as a therapist. So what this does for me is I make you feel how I feel with my client. It's that's called projective identification, where I get a sort of pseudo form of empathy by making you feel how I feel. This function, which is rarely done consciously, serves 2 purposes. One is that it's a form of discharge. I will do to you what has been done to me and see how you like it. Kind of what I was just talking about there. And second, it's an attempt to solve the problem through reenacting it with the here and now relationship. So if I create the same problem, not just talk about it, but actually make it happen between us two, I can see how you handle it. And in a way, hopefully, I can see how it's resolved. The job of the supervisor is to tentatively name the process and thereby make it available to conscious exploration. So making the unconscious conscious. We'll have bread and butter. Okay. In mode 5, the supervisor attends to the quality of the live relationship between the supervisor and supervisee. So the here and now, and does not treat all difficulties in this relationship as originating from client dynamics. No, it's important to know what is parallel process and what isn't, right? So that involves the supervisor being in touch with themselves, knowing who they are, and the therapist. Yalom says that the here and now refers to the immediate, to what is happening here in this office, in this relationship, the in-betweenness, the space between you and me now in this immediate hour. Of course, that's the benefit of focusing on the supervisory relationship in supervision, because that is the relationship happening right now. Although perhaps the therapist-client relationship is, you could argue, more pertinent, and the reason you're in supervision, you don't have access to that relationship immediately. It was, last night, last week, you're referring to memories. So when focusing on the supervisor-supervisee relationship, you can use your real here and now feelings and practice doing that, which you then can take into your therapy experiences with your clients. There are few human situations in which we are permitted, let alone encouraged, to comment upon the behavior of the other. It feels liberating, even exhilarating, but it also feels risky since we are not accustomed to giving and receiving feedback. Again, from Yalom, sort of promoting the liberation that can come from talking about immediacy, the here and now. And Michael Carroll here says it requires that the habitual maps which the persons present have so far evolved are laid open for perusal. So yes, rather than just acting on autopilot within the dynamic, we are looking and talking about the dynamic. Goes from content to process. Okay. Mode 6 then, the supervisor focusing on their own process, obviously intimately related to mode 5. It says here, supervisors, we may find that sudden changes come over us. We may suddenly feel very tired, but become very alert again when the supervisor moves on to another client. We begin to trust these interruptions as being important messages from our unconscious receptors about what is happening both here and now in the room, and also out there in the work with the client. However, in order to trust these eruptions, supervisors must know their own process fairly well. Okay, we briefly mentioned that. So I must know myself well enough to know when something that comes up in me is typical of me and when it is atypical of me, and therefore more likely something happening now specifically between me and you. I must know when I am normally tired, bored, fidgety, fearful, sexually aroused, tensing my stomach, etc., in order to ascertain that this eruption is not entirely my own inner process bubbling away, but is a received import. Okay. I'm just giggling at the overly complicated language there. But yes, I must know the difference between what I generally bring to all relationships, that's me, and what's specifically arising in me because of this here and now interaction. If I'm always shy, for example, it doesn't tell me much about you if I'm shy with you. But if I'm never really shy, but I feel shy with you, it might tell me something about you and our relationship. Supervisors need to attend to their own shifts in sensation and peripheral half thoughts and fantasies while still attending to the content and process of the session. So it's a lot of work listening to the therapist talking about their clients and themselves whilst also paying attention to what's going on within you. For example, while you have been describing your work with so-and-so, I've been getting more and more impatient. Having examined this impatience, it does not seem to be to do with you or something I am bringing to the session from outside. So I wonder if I am picking up your impatience of your client. So that's a sort of tentative interpretation here offered to the therapist. Also within mode 6 is the supervisor's fantasy relationship between them and the client. So the thoughts and feelings that the supervisor has about the client. So the supervisor might say, if I was working with this client, I might think about this or this. Where the feelings of the supervisor are at odds with the experience of the supervisee, it can be that some aspect of the client-supervisee relationship is being denied and experienced by the supervisor. So if I'm feeling, as a supervisor, particularly annoyed by this client, but the therapist is not, maybe that could be something that the therapist is repressed or not aware of. We might help see if that's the case by raising it into awareness. Finally, mode 7, focusing on the wider context in which all this work happens. Now, they go on here in this chapter to do 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. So looking at the context of the first 6 modes. So for example, 7.1 would be the context of the client's background, their work, their family. 7.2, the context of the interventions. So the profession, the organization. This would be where you learnt your training, where the governing body, the agency in which you got referred your clients from. 7.3, the context of the relationship. For example, did the client choose you, or were they referred to you by someone else? The wider world of the supervisee, so the therapist's family, their stage of professional development, their personal history. The context of the supervisory relationship, how did you come to meet one another? Are they part of the organization in which you get your clients, or are they private? Does your supervisor know different models from you? Where did they learn those? That could all be affecting your relationship. The context of the supervisor. So what's going on for the supervisor, their family, their history, their training? This could all be affecting your relationship. So that's all the 7 modes. Just one final point here then on integrating these processes. So some supervisors become habituated to using just the one mode. Therefore, part of training with this model, so a reason this model could be really helpful or useful, is to help supervisors discover the processes that they more commonly use and ones with which they are less familiar, in order to better integrate a balance of focus and attention. So if you very commonly just focus on interventions with your supervisees, you might start looking more at, or think about looking more at least at the therapist-client relational dynamics, or how you feel in relationship to your therapist to your supervisee during the supervision hour. Yes, I know it's confusing to use the words therapist and supervisee interchangeably, and using the word supervisee, supervisor, and supervision, but we're doing well. We're getting through. Finally, then, the most common pattern of the use of different modes in supervision is to begin with mode 1. So you really want to help your supervisor get a picture in their mind's eye of this human being before you do any other work, right? Without that, it's hard to look at the dynamic. It's hard to look at interventions. It's hard to know whether what's happening between you and your supervisor is parallel process. So key, firstly, is respecting the client and bringing the human being that is that client into the room through accurate and experiential description. This might naturally lead on to modes 3 and 4, where you look at your own feelings whilst being with this client after you've described them, and the relationship dynamic that could be happening between the two of you. What happened in the relationship, how this has affected the therapist, and if and when this triggers unconscious communication, you might then switch to modes 5 and 6. So for example, if there's some sort of parallel process, you might raise your attention to your, as I'm talking about this client now, how do I feel telling you, my supervisor, that shifting from 3 and 4 to 5? And if the supervisor then tells you how they feel, about you talking about this client, that moves to mode 6. At any of these stages, one might move from the specific mode to the appropriate submode of 7, so as to reflect on that which is relevant to the wider field. At the end of the exploration of a particular client, the supervisor might then focus back on mode 2 to explore what new interventions the supervisor might utilize at their next session with this client. So once I've brought the client into the room, mode 1, painted a picture of them, talked about how I feel with this client and what dynamics could be happening between us, and whether that could be being paralleled in the relationship with my supervisor, or at least how I feel talking to you, my supervisor, about this client, how the supervisor feels and thinks while hearing about me talk about this client, and any of the external circumstances that are affecting this work. I then might come back to mode 2, to the theory, to the interventions, and decide how am I going to move forward in my next session with this client. Common pattern of how we might use these modes and integrate them. So I think that's all I'm going to have to say about this. I hope that's helpful, and thank you for watching.